In 1990, the company that had put more computers into homes and small businesses than anyone else in the UK faced a catastrophic crisis. Amstrad's highly anticipated PC 2000 series shipped with faulty Seagate hard drives, permanently wiping out the data of thousands of small businesses. The shock was immediate. The brand had dominated the high street for years. They had sold millions of CPC and PCW machines, democratizing technology by treating complex hardware like a simple TV or stereo. Now, the very strategy of maximizing margins with cheap components had turned a trusted name into a massive liability. Returns piled up. Retailers began to pull back. The paradox is that Amstrad did not fail because the public stopped wanting computers. It failed because the computer stopped being a closed, easy-to-use consumer appliance and rapidly became a global commodity. But the real story of Amstrad is not just the story of a faulty hard drive. It is the story of how a company built on cheap plastic and brilliant pragmatism forced the computer out of the hobbyist's bedroom and onto the retail shelves, until the global market decided that cheap was no longer enough. Every week we explore the stories of British machines, platforms, shops, software houses and screens that once taught the country what the future felt like and what happened when the global market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you as we uncover the forces behind lost technology. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, on a high street shelf surrounded by televisions and hi-fi systems in 1984. To understand how Amstrad captured the British market, you first have to understand the mess they were trying to fix. In 1983, the UK computing scene was highly creative, but physically chaotic. If a British parent went to a high street electronics shop or browsed a mail-order advert in a computer magazine, they were not buying a single, neat appliance. They were buying a puzzle. A standard home computer of the era, like the Sinclair ZX Spectrum or the Acorn BBC Micro, was essentially just a plastic wedge containing a processor and memory. To make it work, the user had to provide the rest of the ecosystem. You needed a television to use as a screen, which meant fighting with the family over access to the living room telly. You needed a cassette recorder, bought separately, and a specific cable to load software. And you needed a chaotic nest of power adapters just to switch it all on. Computing in the early 1980s belonged to the bedroom coder, a culture of young enthusiasts who did not mind trailing wires across the carpet, tuning television sets to find a blurry text display, or waiting 10 minutes for a game to load through a hissing audio cassette. It was brilliant, but it was not mainstream retail. Alan Sugar, the founder of Amstrad, Alan Michael Sugar Trading, did not care about the philosophy of computing. He cared about the retail shelf. Before 1984, Amstrad had built an empire not on microchips, but on consumer electronics. They sold car aerials, budget hi-fi systems, and televisions. They understood the psychology of the British consumer, and more importantly, the logistics of high street retail chains like Dixon's, Comet, and Rumbelows. Sugar looked at the booming home computer market and saw a product category that was terrifying to average parents. They did not want to learn basic programming. They did not want to dismantle the family hi-fi to find a spare plug. They wanted an appliance. If Amstrad was going to enter the computer market, they would do it the same way they sold stereo systems. Everything in one box, with one single plug going into the wall. This was a radical departure from Force 3. The idea that a computer company should focus entirely on the processor and leave the peripherals to the user. Instead, Amstrad focused on Force 1, manufacturing costs, supply chains, and retail simplicity. In April 1984, they launched the Amstrad CPC 464. The machine was a revelation in packaging. It came bundled with its own dedicated monitor, either green screen monochrome or full color. The cassette deck was built directly into the keyboard console. The monitor housed the power supply, meaning the entire system ran off one mains plug. The tech press and traditional computing enthusiasts sneered. They mocked the CPC 464 for its chunky, brightly colored keys. They called it a plastic toy built by a hi-fi company. But the consumer reaction was entirely different. The CPC 464 solved the exact problem preventing wider adoption. A parent could walk into a high street shop on a Saturday morning, buy the machine, put it on a desk in the box room, plug it into the wall, and it just worked. There was no tuning required. There was no arguing over the living room television. Amstrad did not care about the philosophy of computing. They cared about the shelf, and in 1984, the shelf was about to be completely rewritten. The release of the Amstrad CPC 464 in the summer of 1984 did not just introduce a new machine. It introduced a completely new way of buying technology in the United Kingdom. Until this point, a large portion of the British microcomputer market existed in the post. Enthusiasts would read computer magazines, study dense mail-order adverts, write a check, and wait 28 days for a Sinclair or an Acorn to arrive in a padded envelope. If a machine did make it into a physical shop, it was often locked in a glass cabinet in a specialist electronics store, intimidating to anyone who did not already understand the jargon. Alan Sugar did not believe in mail order, and he did not care about computing philosophy. He believed in the high street. If Amstrad was going to sell a home computer, a machine designed for household use, loaded with software from tapes, and meant for gaming or simple learning, it had to sit in a shop window next to the video recorders, the hi-fi systems, and the washing machines. It had to be sold where everyday British people already spent their money. To capture the high street, the machine had to look and act like a complete household appliance. The CPC 464 was a masterclass in physical packaging. At its heart, it used a Z80 processor, an older, widely available, and incredibly cheap microchip that performed the core calculations. It featured 64 kilobytes of memory, fast temporary storage the computer used while programs were running, but the internal specifications were completely secondary to the exterior design. The keyboard was long and angular, featuring brightly colored keys that looked slightly toy-like compared to the austere black wedges of rival companies. Crucially, it featured a built-in cassette deck, a physical magnetic tape player set directly into the right-hand side of the console. This eliminated the need for users to buy a separate audio recorder, fiddle with volume dials, and suffer loading errors just to play a game. But the true stroke of genius, and the ultimate retail weapon, was the power delivery. The CPC 464 was sold alongside a bundled monitor, a dedicated screen available in either full color or cheaper green screen monochrome. The power supply for the entire system was built directly into the casing of this monitor. One single cable ran from the monitor to the wall, and another single cable dropped down to power the keyboard unit. It was the ultimate one-plug philosophy. There was no trailing wire, no separate power brick, and most importantly, no need to unplug the family television in the living room. The traditional computing press despised it. Journalists writing for specialist magazines thought the brightly colored keyboard looked absurd. They criticized the lack of standard expansion interfaces. They viewed Amstrad not as a technology pioneer, but as a peddler of cheap plastic audio gear intruding on a serious digital revolution. But the tech press did not dictate the mass market. The British public did not care about the purity of the architecture. Parents, who were terrified of being left behind by the digital age but equally terrified of complex electronics, walked into high street chains like Dixon's, Comet, and Rumbelows and saw a solution. They did not see a compromised machine. They saw a neat, tidy appliance that promised to make their children smarter. The bundle strategy completely changed the economics of buying a computer. If a parent bought a Sinclair ZX Spectrum, the initial price looked cheaper on paper, but by the time they added a compatible tape deck, the necessary cables, and a small portable television to avoid family arguments over the living room screen, the real cost soared. An Amstrad CPC 464 for $199 with a green screen or $299 with a color monitor was the final total price. It was a complete system in a single cardboard box, easily carried out of a shop and placed on a bedroom desk on a Saturday afternoon. Because the system was so easy to buy, the retail chains loved it. Amstrad offered higher profit margins to high street shops than their competitors did. Store managers at Dixon's and Comet gave the CPC 464 prime shelf space because it was highly profitable and, crucially, generated very few returns from confused customers. A shop worker did not have to spend 30 minutes explaining how to plug it in. As the machines flooded British bedrooms and box rooms, the ecosystem followed. Software houses, the British companies coding games and educational programs, initially hesitated to support what they saw as a toy, but network effects, the pattern where a platform becomes exponentially more valuable as more people use it, forced their hand. Millions of CPCs were selling across the UK, and soon across Europe, dominating markets in France and Spain. Developers had to support it. Soon, the software shelves in W.H. Smith and John Menzies were packed with cassette games, specifically branded for Amstrad. Amstrad followed the tape-based CPC 464 with the CPC 6128, a sleeker machine that replaced the cassette deck with a built-in 3-inch floppy disk drive, a removable magnetic storage format that loaded files instantly compared to the agonizing weight of a tape. True to their focus on manufacturing costs, Amstrad chose an obscure, largely unwanted 3-inch drive format from Matsushita in Japan, buying them by the million at a severe discount. By the mid-1980s, Amstrad had successfully bridged the gap between the hobbyist and the mainstream consumer. They had proved that the future of British computing was not going to be decided in a university lab, but at the retail checkout. The living room and the teenager's bedroom had been conquered, but the real money was waiting in the spare room, where a completely different kind of user was still writing letters by hand. By 1985, Amstrad had successfully turned the home computer into a high-street appliance. The Amstrad CPC 464 was sitting in hundreds of thousands of British living rooms, bedrooms, and box rooms, quietly loading cassette tapes in the corner. But the bedroom was only a stepping stone. The real financial prize was not the teenager playing games. It was the British small business. At the time, business computing was fiercely expensive. If a local tradesman, a freelance writer, or a high-street solicitor wanted to digitize their paperwork, the market offered them IBM-compatible machines or early Apple computers that cost thousands of pounds. These systems required separate software purchases, separate monitor purchases, and separate printer cables that rarely communicated perfectly on the first try. Business computing was an investment. Amstrad decided it should be a commodity. In September 1985, Amstrad launched the PCW-8256. It was a dedicated word processor, a computer designed specifically to create, edit, store, and print text, packaged entirely as one unit. For $389 plus VAT, the buyer received a keyboard, a monochrome green screen monitor housing the processor, a built-in 3-inch floppy disk drive, a magnetic storage format used to save and load files, and crucially, a dedicated dot matrix printer. A dot matrix printer, a device that uses a grid of small pins to strike an inked ribbon and press letters onto continuous paper, was usually an expensive peripheral. Amstrad simply bundled it in the box. When a British user carried a PCW-8256 out of a Dixon's, Comet, or Rumbelow shop, they were not buying a box of abstract potential. They were buying an entire administrative ecosystem that worked the moment it was plugged into a single wall socket. The impact on the British workplace was immediate, physical, and structural. The PCW-8256 did not run a standard operating system like MS-DOS. It ran its own bespoke software, primarily a program called LocoScript. LocoScript bypassed the traditional operating system entirely, booting straight from a disk into a word processing environment. It was deeply unintuitive to traditional programmers, but beautifully simple to a copy typist who just wanted to write a letter, format a document, and print it without learning complex command line codes. In a British small business where every pound mattered, the Amstrad PCW did not merely run word processing software. It decided who could digitize their accounts, who could finally afford to print professional invoices, and who felt that the computer was no longer a luxury reserved for the corporate elite. The machine appeared on the desks of pub landlords doing their weekly books in Yorkshire. It sat in the spare rooms of aspiring authors typing manuscripts in London flats. It occupied the back offices of high street estate agents in the Midlands and local council offices across the country. It created a massive, dedicated community. Specialist computer magazines like 8000 Plus filled W.H. Smith newsagent shelves, offering tutorials, hardware modifications, and mail-order adverts for replacement printer ribbons. The PCW series eventually sold an estimated 8 million units across Europe. It created a colossal demand for the specific, proprietary 3-inch floppy disks it used, forcing high street stationery chains to clear shelf space just to supply the physical media Amstrad users required. The company was no longer just a hardware manufacturer. They were dictating the physical infrastructure of British small business. They had proved that the market did not want a modular, complex computing platform. The market wanted a typewriter with a memory, a screen, and a plug. But a dedicated word processor was still a closed loop. The global technology market was moving towards a unified standard, built around the architecture of the IBM personal computer. A standardized framework where different hardware components and software from different companies could all work together. If Amstrad wanted to dominate the actual office, not just the spare room, they had to build an IBM-compatible machine, and they had to build it at a price that would break the industry. In 1986, Amstrad released the PC 1512. It was not merely another computer, it was an aggressive assault on the corporate technology establishment. At the time, an IBM personal computer, the global standard for business hardware, was a modular, expensive system that often cost well over £2,000. It was bought by corporate IT departments, not local high street shop owners. Amstrad applied their established formula to the IBM-compatible market. For $399, a buyer received a complete working system. The monitor housed the power supply, meaning the computer required only one plug for the wall. It came with a keyboard, a floppy disk drive, and crucially, it bundled MS-DOS, the standard, text-based operating system used by IBM-compatible computers. But Amstrad went further. They understood that the blinking cursor of MS-DOS was intimidating to small business owners who had never used a command line interface. So they bundled the PC 1512 with a mouse and gem, a graphical environment manager that provided a visual interface of windows, icons, and menus, long before Microsoft Windows became the default global standard. A British publican, an accountant in a high street firm, or a warehouse manager could now point and click to manage their files. The scale of Amstrad's success was staggering. By 1987, they were not just a British success story, they were a European juggernaut. Amstrad captured an estimated 25% of the entire European personal computer market. They followed the PC 1512 with the PC 1640, adding better graphics and more memory, fast temporary storage a computer uses while programs are running. In a British small business where every pound mattered, the right machine did not merely run software. It decided who first saw their accounts digitized on a screen, who discovered word processing as a daily system, who imagined work beyond the traditional high street, and who felt that the digital future had finally entered the office. Amstrad machines were everywhere. They dominated the front windows of Dixons. They were stacked high on pallets in Comet and Rumbelows. They were sold by independent office supply companies. Computer magazines published thick, monthly issues dedicated solely to Amstrad PC users, filled with mail-order adverts for accounting software, database programs, and desktop publishing packages. Alan Sugar's company had achieved something few thought possible. They had taken the intimidating, expensive world of corporate American computing architecture, repackaged it in Brentwood, and sold it to the British masses as a household appliance. At this peak, Amstrad's manufacturing logistics were a marvel of consumer electronics. They were shipping millions of units, sourcing components globally, and driving down prices through sheer volume. They had proved that computing was no longer a hobbyist pursuit or a corporate luxury. It was a commodity. But building machines at this scale and at this price required absolute perfection in the supply chain. A home computer used for playing cassette games could survive a few technical quirks. A business computer used to manage payroll, print invoices, and store a company's entire financial history could not. Amstrad had conquered the market through price and integration. The brand had found its audience. The market had not yet shown the price of building the future too quickly. The first crack did not happen in a corporate boardroom. It happened at the return counters of British high street shops. In late 1988, small business owners began bringing their new Amstrad computers back to Dixons in independent electronics retailers. The complaint was not that the machines were too slow or that the bundled software was difficult to learn. The complaint was fatal. The computers were losing data. A spreadsheet would save incorrectly. An accounting file would become corrupted. A database of client invoices would vanish into digital static. For a home computer used to load cassette games, a crash was a temporary annoyance. For a business computer used to run a company, data loss was a catastrophe. Amstrad had built its empire by understanding exactly what the British public wanted: affordable, integrated technology that worked straight out of the box. But by 1988, the company wanted to move beyond the small high street trader and the spare room copy typist. They wanted to break into the highly lucrative corporate IT market. To do this, Amstrad launched the PC 2000 series, specifically the PC-2286 and PC-2P6 models. These were powerful machines built to compete directly with high-end corporate hardware from American giants like IBM and Compaq. To make these machines competitive, they required large, fast storage. Amstrad equipped them with drives manufactured by the American firm Seagate. A hard drive, a magnetic storage device that keeps files, software, and operating systems intact even when the power is turned off, is the fundamental memory of a digital business. If the processor is the brain, the hard drive is the filing cabinet. But a flaw in the hard drive controller meant that these specific Seagate drives did not communicate perfectly with the Amstrad hardware. The timing was disastrous. Amstrad had spent years convincing the British public that a cheap computer was not a bad computer. The PCW word processor in the PC-1512 had proved that affordability did not mean compromise. The hard drive failure shattered that promise overnight. When a high street accountant lost a week of client records, they did not blame the American component supplier. They blamed the brand written on the plastic casing. They blamed Amstrad. The fallout was brutal, public, and expensive. Amstrad was forced to recall thousands of machines. They lost millions of pounds replacing the faulty parts and repairing the damage. The computer press, which had spent the previous years praising Amstrad for democratizing technology, turned hostile. Monthly magazines that had previously run glowing reviews and tutorial guides now published angry letters from small business owners who had lost their digital livelihoods. But the problem was deeper than a single faulty component. The hard drive crisis exposed the fragility of Amstrad's entire system. Amstrad's genius had always been supply chain logistics. They sourced the cheapest possible components from Asia, assembled them at massive scale, and pushed them through British retail networks at razor-thin margins. It was a model built perfectly for consumer electronics: televisions, cassette recorders, and basic home computers. But as computers became more complex, and as business users demanded absolute reliability, the cheap component model became a structural trap. A single flawed batch of microchips or a slightly misaligned drive controller could now destroy the reputation of an entire product line. That strength had become the vulnerability. Britain did not stop buying business computers. It simply stopped trusting that the cheapest option was the safest option. At the exact moment Amstrad's reputation fractured, the global technology market shifted. The IBM-compatible standard, the architecture that Amstrad had so successfully brought to the British masses, was no longer a novelty. It was the default global ecosystem. Because it was an open standard, any company could buy a processor from Intel, an operating system from Microsoft, and assemble a working machine. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the market was flooded with generic beige boxes. These were modular, unbranded, or lesser-known PC clones built in Taiwan or assembled in small British workshops. They were cheap, highly customizable, and aggressively priced. At the same time, American corporations like Dell were restructuring their supply chains to compete on price, offering direct mail-order sales and reliable components. Amstrad had taught the British public how to buy an IBM-compatible PC. They had broken the fear of the blinking MS-DOS cursor. They had introduced the mouse and the graphical interface to the high street long before Windows 95 made it universal. But they had inadvertently educated their own customers to look beyond the Amstrad brand. Once a user understood how an IBM-compatible machine worked, they no longer needed the safety of the Amstrad all-in-one box. They could buy a generic machine, plug in a standard monitor, and run exactly the same software. The ecosystem had outgrown the company that popularized it. Amstrad's unique selling proposition, integration and price, was erased by a global industry that was now producing modular components at massive scale. The local Dixon's window was no longer the only place to buy a computer. Mail-order magazines were filling up with adverts for custom-built PCs that offered more memory, faster processors, and standard parts that could be easily upgraded by the user. The PC 2000 crisis was eventually resolved, and Amstrad sued Seagate for the hard drive failures, securing an out-of-court settlement. The machines were fixed. The production lines kept moving. Amstrad continued to release new computers into the early 1990s, attempting to recapture the cultural dominance of the PC 1512. But the gravity had shifted. The high street still sold Amstrad computers, but the corporate IT buyers had already looked away. The small businesses that once viewed Amstrad as a savior now viewed it as a risk. The machine still worked. The market around it had already begun to change. By the mid-1990s, the computing landscape had undergone a permanent transformation. The era of proprietary, all-in-one machines designed by a single British company and sold through high-street electronics shops had collided with a unified global standard. Microsoft Windows 95 had arrived, bringing a universal graphical interface that ran on any standard IBM-compatible personal computer, regardless of whether it was built in Taiwan, assembled in a small workshop in Milton Keynes, or shipped directly by Dell. For Amstrad, the transition was painful and relentless. The company that had once commanded a quarter of the European personal computer market found its margins squeezed from all sides. The high street stores that had once dedicated entire walls to Amstrad CPCs, PCWs, and PC 1512s were now stocking generic multimedia PCs featuring CD-ROM drives, Sound Blaster audio cards, and Pentium processors manufactured by Intel. Alan Sugar and his engineering teams at Brentwood attempted to adapt. They released machines with faster processors, larger hard drives, and upgraded graphics. But the magic of the Amstrad formula had vanished. They were no longer defining the market, they were chasing it. A consumer walking into a Currys or a PC World in 1995 was no longer looking for an integrated appliance that saved them from complexity. They were looking for raw performance, upgradability, and compatibility with the global software standards established by American tech giants. The financial reality of the computer market had also changed. As component prices plummeted and competition intensified, the profit margins on desktop computers dropped to razor-thin levels. Selling cheap hardware required massive, unyielding global volume. Amstrad, operating primarily as a British-led assembler, relying on outsourced components, could no longer compete with the colossal manufacturing economies of scale commanded by multinational PC vendors. Worse still, the cultural connection was fraying. The computer magazines that had once fueled the Amstrad ecosystem, publications like 8000 Plus and PC User, either closed their doors, shifted their focus to Windows-based generic clones, or disappeared from W.H. Smith newsagent shelves altogether. The bedroom coders, school pupils, and small business owners who had formed the backbone of Amstrad's user base had migrated to the wider PC ecosystem. Recognizing that the golden age of high-street computer manufacturing was drawing to a close, Alan Sugar made a decisive pivot. Amstrad began moving away from personal computers, shifting its immense logistical and engineering focus towards telecommunications, digital satellite television receivers. Partnering with BSKB to place millions of satellite dishes on British chimneys, and consumer telephony. In 1997, Amstrad formally sold its PC business to Viglin, a British personal computer supplier founded by Alan Sugar's son, James Sugar. The transaction marked the quiet end of an extraordinary chapter in British consumer technology. The company that had taught a generation how to buy, use, and rely on affordable computing power was stepping back from the desktop market entirely. The factory stopped assembling plastic monitor casings. The warehouse pallets of 3-inch floppy disks dwindled. The high street store windows that once showcased the future of British office work were filled with new brands, new logos, and new promises. The transition was absolute. The assembly lines slowed, the boxes cleared from Dixon's, the software magazines folded, the hardware division sold, the logo remained on satellite dishes and audio gear. The computer age on the high street was over. The brand did not disappear overnight. Long after the Brentwood assembly lines quietened and the last high street pallet of personal computers cleared from Currys and Dixons, the Amstrad name remained a familiar fixture of British living rooms. It sat on the curved plastic casings of satellite receivers bolted to chimney stacks across housing estates from Cornwall to Aberdeen. It appeared on hi-fi systems, twin-deck audio players, and early digital set-top boxes. Alan Sugar's company pivoted into telecommunications and home entertainment with ruthless pragmatism, trading the fragile, low-margin turbulence of the desktop computer market for the booming subscription-backed infrastructure of digital satellite television in partnership with BSKB. Yet the machines that built the empire, the gray-cased CPC series, the green-screen word processors of the PCW range, and the brown chassis MS-DOS compatibles, entered a quiet afterlife. When Amstrad formally sold its PC hardware division to Vigeland in 1997, a company founded by Alan Sugar's son James Sugar, the transition marked the formal end of an era. The high street retail landscape that had championed Amstrad underwent its own violent contraction. The bustling electronics shops with floor-to-ceiling shelves of boxed software, spare printer ribbons, and demonstration keyboards vanished. Dixons transformed into online-focused retail operations. Comet collapsed entirely into liquidation. The local high street, once the noisy venue where a teenager first touched a rubber keyboard or a small business owner inspected their first digital ledger, became a row of coffee shops and betting offices. The physical objects themselves migrated upwards and outwards. They moved from office desks and bedroom corners into loft storage, backroom cupboards, charity shop electrical shelves, and car boot sale cardboard boxes. For millions of British families, an Amstrad computer became an heirloom of a specific analog-adjacent decade, a heavy piece of molded plastic that smelled faintly of warm dust and old circuitry whenever it was dragged out for a curious child or a nostalgic afternoon. Yet the survival of Amstrad in British technology history is not merely a matter of sentimental nostalgia. It proves a fundamental truth about how technology enters a society. Amstrad demonstrated that the primary barrier to digital adoption was never the intelligence of the user. It was friction, cost, and complexity. By treating computers as high-street consumer appliances rather than precision instruments for corporate IT departments, Alan Sugar's company unlocked a market that American manufacturers and traditional electronics firms believed did not exist. They proved that a publican in Yorkshire, a freelance writer in London, and a school pupil in Manchester would embrace computing if the machine arrived complete, integrated, and priced within reach of an ordinary household budget. Today, that legacy survives in unexpected corners of the digital landscape. In Cambridge, at the Center for Computing History and at the National Museum of Computing at Bletchley Park, Amstrad machines occupy pride of place in permanent collections. They stand alongside the BBC Micros and Sinclair Spectrums that define the era, preserved not as historical footnotes, but as physical evidence of a time when British engineering attempted to wire the nation through the high street. Online, dedicated preservationist communities maintain archives of locoscript manuals, cassette loader audio files, and system ROM images, ensuring that the software can still boot on modern hardware through emulators. Software that mimics the architecture of old machines on contemporary screens. The company that once commanded a quarter of the European personal computer market no longer builds computers. The factories are silent. The retail displays are gone. The 3-inch floppy disks have long since lost their magnetism. But the architecture of the modern consumer electronics market, where hardware is bundled, pricing is aggressive, and technology is sold as an appliance rather than a laboratory experiment, runs on the exact principles that Amstrad pioneered in an Essex warehouse. Somewhere in a British loft, beneath a pile of faded winter coats and old cardboard boxes, an Amstrad CPC 464 still rests in the dark, its green and red keys waiting for a cassette tape that hasn't spun in 30 years. See you in the next video.